We're now ready for our second lecture, and we will be looking at the cultural and religious background of Jesus' day. But before we do that, I thought that I would show you a picture of an ancient bust of Titus. At the very end of our last lecture, we talked about how the Romans, under their general Titus, invaded Jerusalem, destroyed the city, destroyed the temple in the year AD 70. And the general was this man, Titus, who later went on to become a Roman emperor. So quite an important person in Roman history. Now then, we can turn to the cultural religious background of Jesus's world. As we're going to see shortly, there were several significant divisions among the Jewish people in Jesus's day. In fact, in some respects, it's more accurate to speak of the Judaisms of Jesus's day than it is to talk about the Judaism of Jesus's day. However, there were several factors that tended to unite the Jewish people and to unite these various groupings of Jews. I want to talk about those for the next few minutes, these factors that tended to unite the Jews together as a people. First of all, there was the belief in one God, not just any God, but the God who had revealed himself to Moses by the name of Yahweh. And the Jews, of course, believed that Yahweh was their only God, and at least later in Jewish history, if not earlier, they believed that Yahweh was the only God who existed. There's a powerful statement of this in Deuteronomy chapter 6, verse 4. It says, "Hear, O Israel, the Lord," that is Yahweh, is God, is our God, Yahweh alone. That's Deuteronomy chapter 6, verse 4. There's also a very powerful statement of monotheism in the book of Isaiah, especially chapters 40 through 55. So this is one of the most important factors that brought Jewish people together, is they all, with very few exceptions, believed in one God, and that God was Yahweh, who had called Abraham and worked with Moses and guided the Jewish people throughout history. Secondly, almost all Jews accepted the divine authority of the Torah. The word Torah, in its strictest sense, refers to the Pentateuch, that is, the first 5 books of the Old Testament, Genesis through Deuteronomy. But the word Torah is sometimes used in a broader sense to refer to all of the books that we as Christians refer to as the Old Testament. Now, Jews had distinctions about were divided on the question of the what the Torah constituted, and but all Jews would agree on the divine authority of the first 5 books of the law. There's no question about that. Torah, in its narrow sense, they could all subscribe to. Now, Jews might disagree as to the interpretation and the application of the Torah, but they were united in the belief that the Torah constituted God's sacred word to Israel. The third factor is that the Jews were united in their belief that Palestine was their God-given possession, having been promised by God to Abraham, and then actually given to Israel through the conquest of Joshua and some later Israelites. The fourth major factor was worship in the Jewish temple in Jerusalem. All of the major factions of Judaism, except for the Essenes, who we think lived in a small place on the Dead Sea called Qumran, all major factions of Judaism, with the exception of the Essenes, participated in the worship of Yahweh in the Jerusalem temple. The temple worship was conducted by priests. They were the only ones who were qualified to officiate at the various ceremonies and offerings that took place in the temple. Furthermore, the temple was the only place in the entire world where, according to God, God permitted animal sacrifices to be offered to him. There was no other place, according to Jewish law, Jewish tradition, where the Jews could acceptably offer various offerings that were required by the law, especially the animal sacrifices. No other place in the world where these could be offered except at the temple in Jerusalem. Now, while we're talking about the temple, we should probably also talk about some of the major ceremonies that took place in the temple. This is a picture of a model of the temple. Obviously, you can see the people standing in the background there, so you can clearly, they're not giants. This is just a model of the temple in the Holy Land Hotel, just in the city of Jerusalem. The big tall building is that you see with the golden columns and gold around the top, that was the actual temple building. Everything else around it were various courts and so on, but the actual temple building is the temple there that you see to the right. This is a diagram, overhead diagram of the temple and the boundaries that kept out all non-Jews. So in other words, these dark, heavy black lines represented walls that separated the Jewish people, and not just Jewish people, but Jewish people who were in a state of ritual cleanness. They were the only ones who could proceed in this far into the temple complex. The big tall building that you saw in the previous picture is located right at the very top of this diagram. It has the word sanctuary, and then just to the top of that there is an M, and I presume that the M stands for the most holy place. This is the small area in the temple that no one was allowed to enter except for the high priest, and only he could do that. He could do that only on the Day of Atonement once a year. So at any rate, don't worry about all the details of this. I just wanted you to sort of see how the courts were structured there. This picture here shows what the ancient temple platform looks like today. And remember, I said that Herod expanded the temple complex so that it reached an area of 36 acres. And so you can see that this is quite a large complex here. All of those dark things that you see there in the complex are trees or vegetation. Of course, back at the time of Jesus, none of that would have been there. It would have all been pavement. The building in sort of almost the center of this complex with the golden dome is called the Dome of the Rock, and it is the third most sacred site to Muslims in the world because, according to Muslim tradition, Muhammad ascended into heaven from this spot. And then to the south of the Dome of the Rock, you see another large structure right up against the wall. This is a very famous mosque called the Al-Aqsa Mosque. You don't need to remember that. But Muslims are able to go up to this, what was the old temple complex. Muslims refer to this as the Noble Sanctuary. And so at any rate, you can still see the same basic outlines of the temple complex as it existed in the time of Jesus. By the way, the ancient Jewish temple was probably located right about where the Dome of the Rock is located, or very close to that. Okay. Now let's talk about major temple activities. First of all, there was an offering called the Tamid. Tamid is a Hebrew word. It simply means continual. And this offering was performed every day, once in the morning around 9 a.m., and then once in the afternoon about 3. This was a offering that was made every day throughout the year, and so it got the name the continual burnt offering. Now, I'm also going to mention the 3 major festivals or feasts of the Jews. And the first one that we'll talk about is the Feast of Tabernacles, or sometimes it's called the Feast of Booths. It falls in October of the year. This feast commemorated the period of wilderness wandering when Israel took her long journey from Egypt to the land of Canaan. And as you remember from Old Testament history, especially in the books of Exodus and Numbers and a little bit Deuteronomy, the Jewish people had their period of wilderness wandering. And as they moved slowly from Egypt to Canaan, they had to live in makeshift huts, and that is the thing that is celebrated by the Feast of Tabernacles. By New Testament times, this feast was also an occasion for prayers for rain for the upcoming wheat and barley harvest. These crops were planted in the fall, and they sprouted, and they got some rain in the fall, and then they went dormant in the winter, and then in the spring with more rain, the crops came on up and then were harvested in the late spring or early summer. I might point out to you that the Palestine, if you didn't know this, is in the northern hemisphere like we are, so our summers and winters and so on correspond to each other. A second major festival was that of Passover. This usually falls in the month of April on our calendar. In the Hebrew calendar, it fell on the month called Nisan. That's not spelled exactly like the car. It's spelled N-I-S-A-N, Nisan, 1S. The 14th day. That was the date of the Jewish month when Passover was held. This festival, you probably already know, celebrated the events of the Exodus at the time when God delivered ancient Israel from Egyptian slavery. The story, of course, is found in the book of Exodus in the Old Testament. In Hebrew, this feast is called Pesach, and it means Passover. So it just means the same thing as our term. It's just Hebrew. For 7 days, immediately following the day of Passover, the Jews celebrated the Feast of Unleavened Bread. This festival also celebrated the Exodus, and it also celebrated the beginning of the barley and the wheat harvest. 50 days from the Sunday following Passover, Passover could fall on any day of the week. So 50 days from the Sunday following Passover, the Jews celebrated a feast called Pentecost, or in the Old Testament, it is called the Feast of Weeks. The word Pentecost is actually a Greek word meaning 50, because of the interval between Passover and the Feast of Pentecost. This usually falls in June, and at this festival, people celebrated the completion of the wheat and the barley harvest. Also, by New Testament times, the Jewish people celebrated the giving of the law of Moses, to Israel on Mount Sinai. So that also became a part of the celebration of Pentecost, at least by the time of Jesus. Now, another factor that tended to unify the Jewish people was the institution of the synagogue. There were weekly Sabbath services in the synagogue. The word synagogue is actually a Greek word which means assembly. Synagogues were local Sabbath, Saturday. Jewish Sabbath day, of course, is equal to our Saturday. Synagogues were local Saturday assemblies in which the congregation prayed, chanted praises, and heard the law and the prophets read and explained. Very important to note that synagogues were found in any significant Jewish community. There's not just one synagogue, as there is only one temple, but many, many synagogues all over Palestine and anywhere that Jewish people had moved to outside Palestine. No sacrifices, no animal sacrifices or any kind of food offerings were performed in the synagogue. And so therefore, a priest was not necessary in order to preside at a synagogue service. Service could be carried on by people who were laymen, who were not priests. Synagogues are not mentioned in the Old Testament, so many scholars believe that the institution and practice of the synagogue probably originated during the Babylonian exile of the Jews. That, of course, took place in the 6th century BC. But if you read the Old Testament carefully, you won't see any references to the synagogue in the Old Testament. And that's probably because the practice really took hold and came into its own after the Old Testament literature was written. Now, we have just surveyed some factors that tend to unite the Jewish people of Jesus' day. Let's now turn to some of the deeply rooted divisions among the Jews. Josephus was a 1st century AD Jewish historian, and he describes 4 sects of the Jews. And Josephus is one of our most important sources for information about these Jewish sects. The New Testament, especially the Gospels, is also an important source. And the so-called Dead Sea Scrolls, which were discovered in the 1940s, has also especially helped us to understand more about the sect called the Essenes. So let's talk about the Pharisees first. According to Josephus, who is writing late in the 1st century, several decades after the time of Jesus, says that the largest of the sects were the Pharisees. The word Pharisees means the separate ones. This group was estimated by Josephus to number around 6,000 during near the end of the first century AD. Now, this number 6,000 probably just refers to the men who were the heads of households. So there are actually a lot more Pharisees, but if you include the wives and the children and so on. This group may have evolved from that group that we studied earlier back in the 2nd century BC, those Jews that are called the Hasidim. And remember, they joined together with the Maccabean family and fought against the Syrians. So some scholars think that the Pharisees in the days of Jesus had evolved out of that older group, the Hasidim. Now, the Pharisees accepted not only the divine authority of the Pentateuch, the first 5 books of the Old Testament, but also they believed in the divine authority of 2 more sections, or 2 more collections of sacred scripture. These would be called the prophets and the writings. And when you put the law and the prophets and the writings together, that is essentially what we view, Christians today view as the Old Testament. They not only accepted this larger canon of Scripture, but also they accepted the divine authority of a body of oral interpretation of the law. And sometimes this was called the tradition of the elders. It's referred to in this way in the Gospel of Mark, chapter 7, verse 5. This was an oral law which was passed down from one generation of Pharisaic teachers to another, and at least in the first century was not in written form. Later on, by about AD 200, it was written down. It was organized and written down, but not in the time of Jesus. The Pharisees believed that this oral law was given by God at Mount Sinai along with the Torah, and that both were authoritative and that they were both from God. In the New Testament, the Pharisees especially seem concerned about the proper observance of Sabbath keeping, tithing, and the laws of ritual purity. Now, I should mention that tithing for ancient Jews was not primarily a matter of taking a certain percentage of their income and giving it to the temple or whatever in the form of money, but that all agricultural products were supposed to be tithed. In other words, a tenth of your produce, whatever that produce is supposed to be given to God. It would be given to the priest, of course. And so the Pharisees did not want to eat any food that had not been properly tithed. These concerns of the Pharisees meant that they were going to be very leery of eating with Jews who did not follow Pharisaic practices, because maybe the food would not be properly prepared, maybe the food had not been properly tithed, and so it was much safer for Pharisees to stay to themselves and socialize together and eat only with other Pharisees. In contrast to another group that we're going to talk about in a minute, the Sadducees, the Pharisees believed in the immortality of the soul, but also they believed in a future resurrection of the body. So that's another belief of theirs that distinguished them from, say, the Sadducees that we'll talk about a little later. Scholars think that probably most of the scribes, the people who are called scribes in the Gospels, were probably Pharisees. Scribes were men who had received an advanced, specialized training in the Torah. So they were the theological experts of the day. They were also in charge of maintaining and copying the sacred scriptures. They also functioned as lawyers in the Jewish legal court because, of course, in Jewish jurisprudence, the cases were to be decided on the basis of the Hebrew Bible. And so, naturally, the scribes, who were experts in the law of Moses, would be the best people to serve as lawyers. Another powerful sect were the Sadducees. The name Sadducees probably means something like the descendants of Zadok. Zadok was a very important high priest at the time of King David in the Old Testament. And there came to be the notion that all high priests would have to be descendants of Zadok, so that if a priest was not could not trace his ancestry back to Zadok, he would not be qualified to be a high priest. The Sadducees were composed in the New Testament times of the high priest and other powerful aristocratic priests. The New Testament refers to these men as chief priests with an S on the end. They were conservative politically. They wanted to maintain the status quo because their power and their wealth depended largely upon the favor of Rome. The Romans, of course, controlled Palestine, and the Romans gave the high priest and the chief priest a certain amount of authority and power within that power structure. And so, therefore, no high priest who refused to cooperate with the Romans could hope to retain his title. So their motto, of course, was "Don't rock the boat." They were relatively powerful. They were apparently very rich, and they did not want things to change. The Sadducees also did not accept the divine authority of any of the Old Testament books except for the Pentateuch, the 5 books of Moses. They also rejected the authority of the Pharisaic oral tradition, the tradition of the elders. In the New Testament, they are especially notable because they reject belief in bodily resurrection. And so they appear oftentimes as opposed to the Pharisaic notion of resurrection. After the temple was destroyed in AD 70, the Sadducees, who were priests, lost their sphere of power and control. Without the temple, they had no base of control or power. And furthermore, the Judaism that survived the catastrophe of AD 70 was largely dominated by the Pharisaic viewpoint. And so we wish we knew more about the Sadducees, but they essentially lost in their competition with the Pharisees, and we all know that the winners are the ones who write the history. So we don't know a whole lot about the Sadducees, don't have very much Sadducean literature, ancient Sadducean literature. We mostly know the Sadducees through the New Testament and through the literature that was left later by the Jewish rabbis, who were primarily of the Pharisaic viewpoint. The third sect are the Essenes. The best known Essene community is the one at a place called Qumran. This was on the northwest shore of the Dead Sea. I hope you have printed up your map of Palestine by now so that you can locate where Qumran is, and you will see it there on the northwest shoulder of the Dead Sea. The Essenes at Qumran probably evolved out of the Hasidim of the 2nd century BC. So it appears, at least it's the general view, that the Hasidim of the 2nd century BC evolved into two groups, two competing groups, the Pharisees and the Essenes. There is some dispute, however, about the place called Qumran. I would say the majority position is that the ruins that are found at Qumran today are regarded as being left from an Essene community, almost like a monastery. But there is a bit of controversy about that view. There are some scholars who have argued that what the ruins at Qumran were the ruins of an ancient pottery factory and had nothing to do with an Essene village. But that's a minority view rather than the majority view. The name Essenes is probably a Greek form of an Aramaic word which means pious ones or devout ones. By the way, that's the same basic meaning as the Hebrew word Hasidim. So this is one of the reasons for the theory that the Essenes are an extension of the ancient Hasidim. The Essenes at Qumran probably originated in the latter part of the 2nd century BC, and their leader is known from their literature as the teacher of righteousness. In the so-called Dead Sea Scrolls, at least in some of those scrolls, he is referred to as the teacher of righteousness, but he is never named. And he apparently had a falling out with one of the priests in Jerusalem, who in the Dead Sea material is simply referred to as the wicked priest. His name is not given either. We think that these Essenes abandoned the temple and temple worship in Jerusalem because they believed that the temple was corrupt, because they believed that the Maccabean high priest had no right to their office because they were not descendants of Zadok. So I mentioned a while ago this notion that the high priest should be a descendant of the ancient high priest Zadok. Apparently the Essenes denied that the Maccabean high priest in the 2nd century really were descended from Zadok. And so they pulled out of the temple and wouldn't have anything to do with the temple as long as the person controlling the temple, the high priest, was not legitimate. The Dead Sea Scrolls, which were found in caves very near the Qumran community, these scrolls reveal that the Essenes at Qumran regarded themselves as the faithful remnant of Israel, waiting in the desert for the coming of the end times. This was a very end time oriented group. They believed that they lived at the very end of human history as we know it, and that the end times were coming soon. They believed that their community was a fulfillment of Scripture. In Isaiah chapter 40, verse 3, there is reference to a voice in the desert that cries out, "Prepare the way of the Lord." And the people at Qumran, the Jews at Qumran, believed that they were that voice, that their community was that voice that was actually mentioned in Isaiah chapter 40, verse 3. The Qumran community, of course, came to an end at the hand of the Romans. The Romans destroyed Qumran in the year AD 68 and brought that community to an end. However, fortunately, nobody knew about those scrolls in the nearby caves, and they remained there, apart from human touch or human eyes, for about 2,000 years until they were discovered in the 1940s. Wonderful story, and you should learn more about it. Now, the fourth sect that we'll talk about are the Zealots. This group probably developed a few years before the Jewish revolt that took place in the year AD 66. And the Zealots were the people who were primarily responsible for instigating that revolt. There were many Jews who did not want to revolt against the Romans, and they thought that it was suicide. But the Zealots, by their actions and their words, managed to lead the nation as a whole into a disastrous revolt against the Romans. The Zealots deeply resented domination by foreign pagans, and they advocated violent rebellion as the only proper response to Roman rule. Their motto was, "God helps those who help themselves." And so they believed that if they would begin the revolt against the Romans, that just like in the stories of Joshua and the Israelites coming into the Promised Land, that even though they were much smaller than their opponents, that God would be with them and give them victory. It turned out to be not true. Now that I want to turn to a slightly different topic, and that is the languages of Palestine. This is still part of the cultural background of Jesus' day. Around the beginning of the 20th century, there was a German scholar whose name is Gustav Dahlmann. He presented arguments that convinced the scholarly world that almost all Jews in Jesus' day who lived in Palestine would have spoken a language called Aramaic, that would have been their mother tongue. And so, therefore, Jesus probably would have grown up hearing Aramaic in his family, that would have been the mother tongue of his family and other Jewish families living in Palestine. Aramaic is a language which is closely related to Hebrew, but it's a separate language. They're both considered Semitic languages. And even though the Gospels, our Christian Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, are written in Greek, there are still Aramaic words and expressions that appear in the Greek Gospels. Of course, these words and expressions are written in Greek letters, but they're not Greek words. They're Aramaic words or Aramaic phrases. Good examples of this would be, a good example would be the word Abba. According to the Gospel of Mark, Jesus, at least on one occasion, addressed God in prayer as Abba. Also, the name that Jesus gave to Simon. According to the Gospel of John, when Jesus met Simon, the brother of Andrew, he changed his name to Cephas, or in Aramaic it would have been pronounced Kepha. And this is an Aramaic word which means rock. Also in Mark chapter 5, Jesus raises from the dead a young girl. And according to Mark's gospel, when Jesus spoke to her, he used the expression Talitha cum. And that is an Aramaic phrase which means, little girl, get up. So these little words and phrases in our Greek Gospels are sort of like fossils. They allow us to sort of peer back behind the time when the Christian tradition about Jesus was written in Greek, and to realize that probably Jesus and his disciples spoke Aramaic most of the time, and that's probably what the teachings of Jesus were given in originally. Another language which was in some use in Palestine in Jesus' day was Hebrew. Hebrew, of course, had been the language of the Jewish people prior to the Babylonian exile in the 6th century. And even though Jewish people as a whole were not speaking Hebrew in Jesus' day, it continued to be known and used by the scribes, the theological experts who had this advanced education in the Torah. If they were going to be able to be experts in the Old Testament, or what we call the Old Testament, they are going to have to know Hebrew. I might mention that all of the books of that we call the Old Testament were written in Hebrew, except for the book of Daniel, which, strangely enough, is partly written in Hebrew and part of it is written in Aramaic. That's obviously very strange. So Hebrew was known and used, but probably by a relatively select group of people, namely the scribes. Greek was spoken throughout the Mediterranean world and was probably the primary language of the residents of Palestine who were not Jewish. So Palestine in Jesus' day had areas within it which were primarily populated by Jewish people and other areas that were primarily non-Jewish. The non-Jewish population probably mostly spoke Greek. And then finally, you might have heard a little bit of Latin in Palestine because Palestine, of course, was being governed by the Romans, and Roman administrators would have spoken Latin. The Roman administration of Palestine in the days of Jesus was at the large port city called Caesarea. And so if you hung around Caesarea, you might have heard a little Latin spoken on the part of some of the Roman administrators there. So that brings us to an end of our discussion of the cultural religious background of Jesus's life. We had to fly through, and lots of things we wish we could have done more in detail. But that's it for today. Goodbye.